Nick Reiner was born into a world most people could only dream of, a life drenched in privilege, protection, and excess. His home in Brentwood stood as a symbol of wealth and security, a sprawling villa where sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows onto polished floors and manicured gardens. The reputation of his father, Rob Reiner, cast a golden halo over the family name, while his mother, Michelle, ensured that Nick's every need, every desire, every whim was met without hesitation. From the earliest moments of his life, Nick was shielded from discomfort, from disappointment, from any consequence that might threaten the cocoon of safety his parents had constructed around him. For more than 30 years, Nick had never known deprivation. He attended private schools where discipline and challenge were always buffered by tuition payments and parental intervention. Therapy sessions and rehabilitation programs were arranged meticulously, an ever-present safety net designed to correct, soothe, and protect. Every failure, every misstep, every personal setback was caught, softened, and rectified by a system of wealth and devotion that left Nick insulated from reality. To him, love was absolute. Consequences were optional. Even as he moved into adulthood, Nick's independence remained a carefully orchestrated illusion. Monthly allowances ensured that financial strain never touched him. Housing, transportation, opportunities, all provided, all guaranteed, all unearned. He drifted between attempts at employment or personal projects with no real urgency, knowing that home would always be there, open and forgiving. Each failure was cushioned, each mistake forgiven, each transgression erased by money, by protection, by parental devotion. Nick's life existed in a delicate balance, a bubble where the line between privilege and dependence blurred completely. This life of security, however, was also a cage. The very love and protection that sustained him became invisible bars, confining his ability to stand independently. Decisions were rarely his own. Challenges were often artificial. Consequences were always delayed or softened. There was no pressure to adapt, no necessity to confront the world on his own terms, no experience of survival without safety nets. Over time, comfort and indulgence became inseparable from vulnerability. Strength and resilience were unpracticed, untested, and fragile. As the shadow of tragedy approached, the patterns of Nick's life revealed their cruel implications. The combination of absolute indulgence, fragile mental health, and unchallenged dependency formed the foundation upon which disaster would be built. The environment that had once protected him would soon vanish completely, replaced by a world that would demand survival, not comfort, accountability, not indulgence, resilience, not dependency. Nick Reiner had never known deprivation, and soon he would know it in its harshest form. The journey from Brentwood's sunlit halls to the cold, unforgiving walls of Twin Towers Correctional Facility was not merely a change of address. It was the first step into a psychological abyss, a descent that would test every facet of a life shaped by luxury, softened by love, and ultimately unprepared for the merciless reality that awaited. The arrest of Nick Reiner was swift, shocking, and irrevocable. The golden bubble that had cushioned him for more than 3 decades shattered in an instant. For the first time in his life, Nick was confronted not with gentle correction, not with guidance and indulgence, but with authority, consequence, and the cold machinery of the criminal justice system. Handcuffs replaced the open doors of his Brentwood home. Fluorescent lights replaced sunlight, and the silence of wealth was replaced by the relentless noise of a world that no longer answered him. He had crossed a threshold from privilege into a reality designed to punish, control, and contain. Taken to the Twin Towers Correctional Facility, a sprawling complex in downtown Los Angeles, Nick entered an environment that few could endure without psychological cost. This was a jail notorious for its overcrowding, its dilapidated cells, and its pervasive neglect. Broken toilets went unrepaired for weeks, damp mold clung to walls, and a stench of waste and decay mixed endlessly with the air. Fluorescent lights never switched off, creating a constant, oppressive hum that pressed on the mind as much as on the body. The jail housed thousands of inmates, many with histories of extreme violence, mental illness, and substance abuse. For someone like Nick, untested, sheltered, and fragile, every element of this environment was a direct assault on his psyche. The transition was immediate and brutal. Reports indicate that Nick began to unravel almost as soon as he was placed in a cell. Screams echoed through the corridors in the dead of night. Fragmented pleas of innocence and desperation repeated over and over. "Let me out. I'm innocent," became a mantra, a futile effort to assert control over a world that had stripped him of it entirely. He was now part of a system where survival was measured not in wealth or status, but in physical and mental resilience, in the ability to navigate fear, and in the capacity to endure relentless psychological pressure. Isolation, both physical and social, was a constant. Nick spent hours curled in the corner of his cell, avoiding contact with fellow inmates, but the attempt at invisibility offered little protection. Violence, subtle intimidation, and the threat of exploitation were ever present. Inmates with access to drugs, contraband, and influence quickly recognized weakness, and Nick, for all his size and stature, carried no experience, no allies, and no currency of survival other than the reputation of a name now permanently associated with tragedy. Addiction, already part of his personal history, became a tool wielded by others, a mechanism through which he could be manipulated, coerced, and controlled. Food, something that had never been a concern in his life, became a source of dread. Cold trays, rock-hard bread, and moldy portions left him unable to eat, further weakening his body and compounding the psychological stress. The very act of sustaining himself became a daily struggle, an exertion previously foreign to a life of comfort. Chronic sleeplessness, triggered by screams, metal clangs, and sudden disturbances, chipped away at his stability, leaving him in a near-constant state of anxiety and hypervigilance. Mental health care in Twin Towers, though formally available, proved inadequate in practice. Reports suggest that medications were administered more to control behavior than to treat underlying conditions. Fragmented oversight and understaffing meant that prolonged crises often went unaddressed. Nick's defense team submitted petitions highlighting the excessive brutality and the risk posed to his well-being, but these efforts were largely dismissed, leaving him trapped within the facility's unyielding routines. The psychological contrast was stark. For decades, Nick had been insulated from consequences, mistakes cushioned, failures repaired, and his every action buffered by wealth and parental devotion. Now he faced a world indifferent to history, status, or fragility. Every decision, every movement, and every word had potential consequences. Physical size, which once may have impressed in a world of luxury, offered little protection against inmates who had honed survival skills over years, if not decades, of incarceration. Within days, patterns of psychological collapse emerged. Nick would alternate between lucidity and confusion, sometimes speaking in his own voice, other times adopting the voices of his parents or recalling moments of past safety as if they were present. Episodes of laughter, sobbing, screaming, and whispering were reported to occur in rapid succession, creating a landscape of mental instability that those familiar with the environment described as both chaotic and tragic. The cell became a stage for a mind unraveling, a stark illustration of the collision between privilege and punishment, shelter and exposure, indulgence and consequence. Nick's experience in Twin Towers marked the first true confrontation between his protected past and the harsh demands of reality. The environment, designed for containment and control, did not temper behavior, but exposed every fragility, every weakness, every untested facet of character. In a place where survival depended on resilience, adaptability, and sometimes ruthless cunning, Nick's history of indulgence, lack of independence, and untreated psychological vulnerabilities placed him in immediate danger. As he navigated the first days and weeks, it became clear that this was not merely a holding facility awaiting trial. For Nick, it was the beginning of a profound and ongoing descent, where each day would strip away layers of psychological armor, revealing vulnerabilities that had long been hidden behind wealth, love, and protection. The journey from arrest to confinement at Twin Towers would prove to be not only a test of legal fate, but a harrowing battle for survival in the unforgiving crucible of one of Los Angeles' harshest detention facilities. Nick Reiner's first weeks inside Twin Towers Correctional Facility revealed a reality far removed from anything he had ever known. The jail, notorious for its harsh conditions and high-profile detainees, was not merely a holding space. It was a battleground where survival depended on a combination of physical presence, psychological resilience, and an understanding of the unspoken rules of inmate society. For Nick, who had spent over 30 years insulated from adversity, the environment was overwhelming in both scale and intensity. The facility was a sprawling complex designed to contain thousands of inmates, many with histories of violence, severe mental illness, and substance dependency. Cells were cramped, damp, and suffused with the smell of mold, waste, and decay. Broken toilets, infestations of rats and insects, and foul, unpalatable food created a daily regimen of discomfort and stress. Fluorescent lights blared constantly, disrupting sleep patterns, while the echo of metal doors and sudden scuffles filled the corridors with a ceaseless tension. For someone like Nick, accustomed to the expansive rooms, manicured lawns, and quiet luxury of his Brentwood home, the sensory assault was immediate and disorienting. Reports suggest that Nick's initial coping mechanisms were minimal. He often withdrew to the corners of his cell, curling up to avoid interaction, yet this isolation offered only a fragile semblance of safety. Other inmates quickly identified his vulnerabilities. Without financial resources, experience, or allies, Nick became a target for manipulation, coercion, and exploitation. Addiction, a pre-existing issue, was particularly perilous. Substances within the jail were currency, and those struggling with dependency were often exploited to run errands, smuggle contraband, or absorb risk on behalf of others. Each task, each compromise, further eroded Nick's autonomy, drawing him deeper into the relentless machinery of prison life. Even basic sustenance became a struggle. The food provided was described as cold, unappetizing, and sometimes moldy. Nick reportedly stared at his meals for prolonged periods before pushing trays aside, unable to force himself to eat. Skipping meals, whether from aversion or despair, weakened him physically, compounding the psychological strain of confinement. The constant, oppressive environment of Twin Towers left no room for comfort, and even the simplest tasks, eating, sleeping, moving within the facility, carried the weight of continuous threat and judgment. Psychological deterioration was evident early. Nick's mental state fluctuated rapidly, alternating between lucidity and confusion. He reportedly spoke in fragmented sentences, sometimes claiming innocence, other times adopting the voices of his parents, or speaking in tones resembling child. Episodes of panic, screaming, and laughter occurred without warning, reflecting the destabilizing effect of constant sensory stress and isolation. Observers noted that even brief periods of intervention, staff asking him to breathe, speak clearly, or remain calm, provided only temporary relief. Once attention shifted, Nick would relapse into the same disordered patterns, as if trapped in a loop between memory and immediate reality. The social dynamics of the jail presented another layer of danger. Inmates were sorted by informal hierarchies based on violence, experience, and influence. Nick's crime, the murder of his parents, made him a pariah within this system, lowering his status and attracting scrutiny. Small mistakes, a single misplaced glance or word, could trigger aggression or intimidation. Inmates with contraband, networks, and hardened resilience observed him closely, testing his reactions and exploiting any sign of weakness. Without prior experience navigating such a world, Nick's physical presence, though imposing in stature, offered little protection. Size alone could not compensate for naivety, lack of alliances, and unfamiliarity with the rules of survival in such a setting. Medical and psychological support within Twin Towers was fragmented and largely insufficient. Medications were often used to control behavior rather than provide therapy, and staff shortages meant crises could go unaddressed for hours or days. Nick's history of substance abuse and mental instability intersected dangerously with this lack of structured support. Episodes of dissociation, identity confusion, and panic were met with minimal intervention, leaving him to endure an environment that amplified his vulnerabilities rather than mitigated them. The cumulative impact of Twin Towers conditions on Nick was profound. Physical deterioration, psychological strain, and constant social threat converged to create a relentless, inescapable pressure. Each day eroded his sense of self, his capacity for independent thought, and his physical well-being. The contrast with the life he had known, a life of shelter, support, and indulgence, was stark, emphasizing the magnitude of the challenge. Nick's existence had shifted from one of comfort and protection to a daily struggle for survival, where every moment demanded vigilance. Every interaction carried potential danger, and every lapse could have irreversible consequences. In this environment, the concept of time itself became a form of torment. Days stretched interminably, punctuated by medication rounds, checks by staff, and the unpredictable behavior of fellow inmates. For Nick, each hour compounded his sense of isolation and vulnerability, and every interaction reinforced the reality that wealth, fame, and family protection no longer existed as buffers. Survival required adaptation, a skill he had never been forced to develop, and the psychological toll of his new reality set the stage for the further deterioration of his mind and body in the days and weeks to come. As days turned into weeks within the confines of Twin Towers Correctional Facility, Nick Reiner's mental state deteriorated rapidly. The isolation, the oppressive environment, and the constant threat from fellow inmates combined to create a psychological pressure cooker. Observers report that Nick's once controlled demeanor gave way to erratic and unpredictable behavior. His screams echoed through the narrow corridors, alternating between frantic cries and fragmented, incomprehensible phrases. "I didn't do it. It wasn't me," he reportedly repeated, sometimes in a deep, trembling voice, at other times in the high, quivering tone of a child. These outbursts were punctuated by moments of silence, followed by sudden, unexplained laughter or muttering to himself, revealing the profound disorientation that had overtaken his mind. Nick's cell became a stage for a relentless internal struggle. He would sit pressed against the cold concrete walls, staring at invisible points in the air, speaking to imagined figures, and assuming the voices of his deceased parents. At times he addressed himself as Mom or Dad, as though reliving conversations in comfort that could no longer exist. These episodes of dissociation were intermittent, creating a dangerous unpredictability. During rare periods of lucidity, Nick could answer questions or appear aware of his surroundings, but any loud noise, a metal door slamming, footsteps echoing in the hall, would trigger an immediate return to chaos. The line between memory, delusion, and present reality blurred entirely, leaving him trapped within a cyclical torment that his mind could neither escape nor control. The physical and psychological conditions of Twin Towers exacerbated this instability. Overcrowded cells, constant noise, poor sanitation, and inadequate food accelerated both mental and physical decline. Inmates with criminal histories spanning decades, many hardened by violence, posed continuous threats. Nick, unaccustomed to confrontation and entirely dependent on privilege for security, had no defenses against these threats. Every interaction carried a risk of humiliation, aggression, or exploitation. Sources indicate that he was forced to navigate these dynamics carefully, balancing invisibility with minimal engagement. Yet even the smallest misstep could provoke retaliation. Medical intervention within the facility, proved insufficient. Medications were administered primarily to control behavior, rather than treat underlying conditions. Psychotherapy or consistent mental health support was largely unavailable. Nick's history of substance abuse compounded the problem, creating an environment where withdrawal, craving, and manipulation by other inmates could spiral unchecked. Episodes of self-harm, panic, and identity confusion reportedly occurred with alarming frequency. The combination of substance dependency, psychological fragility, and the harsh realities of confinement left Nick in a precarious, life-threatening state. The implications of his mental collapse extended beyond daily survival. They intersected directly with his legal defense. Nick's attorneys pursued an insanity defense, emphasizing his long-standing psychological issues, substance abuse history, and the destabilizing effects of his environment. Yet, even if the court were to accept this argument, it would not translate to freedom. Rather, Nick would be transferred to a forensic psychiatric hospital, where he would live under strict 24-hour surveillance among other individuals with severe mental disorders. Reports from such facilities suggest that release is exceedingly rare, often taking decades, and the environment is controlled through heavy sedation, isolation, and regimented routines. For Nick, this would represent a different form of imprisonment, indefinite, monitored, and inescapable. The precariousness of his mental state also raised questions about competency. Observers and legal experts questioned whether Nick could participate meaningfully in his defense, understand the charges, or engage with his attorneys. Each lapse in lucidity could complicate proceedings, delay trials, and exacerbate his isolation. The challenge was not simply whether Nick would be found guilty, but whether his mind would remain intact enough to comprehend and respond to the legal process. His deteriorating psychological condition risked turning the courtroom itself into a theater of confusion, further underscoring the severity of his predicament. Underlying all these pressures was the weight of consequence. Nick's crime, the murder of his own parents, carried a social and psychological stigma both inside and outside the facility. Inmates, staff, and the broader public viewed the act with horror, adding layers of isolation and danger. Without family support, without financial resources, and without the protective networks he had relied upon for decades, Nick was left exposed to the harsh realities of the prison system. Social and psychological capital, which had once cushioned every failure, no longer existed. Every day was a confrontation with vulnerability, and every night reinforced the absence of the safety nets that had defined his life. Nick's experience in Twin Towers represents a tragic convergence of privilege, psychological fragility, and the unrelenting harshness of incarceration. The jail's environment, designed for containment and security, magnified his weaknesses rather than mitigating them. The interplay between mental collapse and legal uncertainty created a scenario where survival became an existential challenge. Each episode of screaming, each instance of identity confusion, and each period of isolation pushed him closer to the edge. For Nick Reiner, the legal process, the physical environment, and his own psychological state combined into a relentless pressure, a trial of mind and body from which there was no immediate escape. The question that now hangs over him is stark. In a world stripped of privilege, support, and protection, how much of Nick Reiner's mind, identity, and what can endure before it is irreversibly fractured? The journey from the luxury of Brentwood to the cold, suffocating cells of Twin Towers has become a test not only of survival, but of the human capacity to withstand the consequences of both crime and circumstance. Life inside Twin Towers Correctional Facility quickly became a harsh education in survival, one that Nick Reiner had never experienced in his life of privilege. Beyond the squalid conditions, the overcrowded cells, and the oppressive sensory environment, there existed a rigid and unforgiving social hierarchy that governed every aspect of inmate life. In this world, status was not determined by wealth, family name, or past accomplishments. Instead, it was defined by strength, cunning, and the ability to endure constant pressure. For Nick, who had spent decades insulated from challenge and consequence, every day represented a confrontation with a reality he was ill-prepared to navigate. The informal hierarchy within the jail was both subtle and absolute. Inmates with criminal experience, networks, or access to contraband-wielded power, while those without resources or alliances were immediately relegated to the bottom. Nick's crime, murdering his own parents, made him notorious but not respected. His status as a wealthy individual carried no weight in this underground economy. Without money, connections, or street-hardened survival skills, Nick became an easy target for manipulation, coercion, and intimidation. Observers report that he was repeatedly tested by other inmates, forced to prove himself through compliance, minor risk-taking, and sometimes even by taking blame for activities he did not commit. Exploitation came in many forms. Addiction, already part of Nick's personal history, became a tool through which inmates could control him. Drugs were not merely recreational in prison. They were currency, leverage, and a mechanism of social domination. Nick reportedly found himself running errands, moving contraband, or standing guard during searches, receiving only enough to survive one day at a time. Each task eroded his autonomy further, binding him into a cycle of dependency and obligation. What had once been a life of choice and abundance had transformed into a precarious existence, where every decision carried potential consequences and every misstep could trigger retaliation. Physical danger was omnipresent. Inmates in twin towers carried histories of violence, and the jail environment rewarded the cunning and the aggressive. A single error in judgment, a misplaced glance, or a wrong word could provoke conflict. Nick, towering in stature but untrained in confrontation, lacked both experience and social protection. Observers noted that his body, though imposing, lacked the conditioning and awareness necessary to deter aggression in this environment. Physical strength alone was insufficient against individuals who had honed survival skills through years of incarceration, networking, and calculated intimidation. Psychological strain compounded the threat. The constant noise, the clanging metal, and the ever-present tension prevented rest and heightened anxiety. Nick's panic episodes, identity confusion, and alternating periods of lucidity and disorientation left him vulnerable not only to physical exploitation, but also to psychological manipulation. Inmates, and even some staff, could anticipate his reactions, exploit his confusion, and push him into situations that further destabilized his mental state. Sleep deprivation, coupled with the stress of navigating the jail's social landscape, accelerated the deterioration of both mind and body. Even minor tasks became exercises in survival. Standing in line, sharing confined space, or remaining silent at the right moments demanded constant awareness. Failure to adhere to these unwritten rules could result in isolation, ridicule, or targeted aggression. Every day, Nick had to measure his actions, speech, and demeanor against a backdrop of latent threats, where respect was earned through calculated behavior rather than assumed by status. The psychological toll of perpetual vigilance, combined with the squalor and deprivation of the environment, created conditions that many would consider unsustainable. Medical and mental health support was insufficient to offset these pressures. Medications were administered inconsistently and primarily to control behavior, rather than provide therapeutic care. Psychological interventions were limited, and staff were stretched thin, unable to address the specific needs of high-risk or mentally fragile inmates. Nick's prior substance abuse and ongoing psychological instability were inadequately addressed, leaving him trapped in a feedback loop of stress, panic, and exploitation. Interactions with other inmates often forced Nick into morally and physically compromising positions. He was sometimes compelled to assume the role of a stand-in for contraband or illicit activities, taking responsibility for actions that were not his own in exchange for temporary protection or minor privileges. This cycle eroded his agency and reinforced his vulnerability. As each day passed, Nick became increasingly enmeshed in the system, his survival dependent on navigating a maze of coercion, risk, and subservience. The contrast with his previous life could not have been starker. In Brentwood, he had been insulated from consequences, cushioned from hardship, and constantly supported. In Twin Towers, every aspect of his identity, strength, and independence was tested. The jail was indifferent to fame, wealth, or family legacy. In its ecosystem, survival demanded adaptation, strategy, and resilience, none of which Nick had been forced to develop. Each interaction, each challenge, and each threat chipped away at the self-assurance he had carried, leaving him exposed to the harshest realities of human behavior under extreme pressure. Nick Reiner's days in Twin Towers illustrated the relentless, unyielding nature of the prison hierarchy. He was no longer the protected son of wealthy Hollywood parents. He was a vulnerable individual at the mercy of an unforgiving social ecosystem. Each choice, each inaction, and each miscalculation brought consequences, gradually eroding both his body and mind. The combination of psychological fragility, physical threat, and systemic exploitation created a daily test of endurance, a trial in which failure could mean permanent damage, injury, or worse. In this environment, survival was not merely a measure of physical strength. It was a complex equation of mental fortitude, social awareness, and the ability to navigate a world entirely indifferent to prior privilege. As the days at Twin Towers Correctional Facility dragged into weeks, Nick Reiner's psychological deterioration intensified. The relentless pressure of confinement, combined with chronic isolation and constant exposure to threat, began to fracture his sense of self. Observers described episodes where he no longer clearly distinguished between memory and reality. At times, he spoke as if he were his father, at others as if he were his mother, and occasionally as the child he once was. These shifts were unpredictable, occurring in rapid succession, leaving him disoriented and exhausted. His mind, once sheltered and untested, was being systematically eroded by an environment that demanded resilience he had never developed. Nick's previous life of wealth and indulgence offered no preparation for the relentless psychological assault of Twin Towers. Every day, he was confronted with the stark absence of protection. No familial intervention, no financial cushion, and no social influence that could shield him from harm. The informal hierarchy among inmates, based on experience, violence, and control, placed him at the very bottom. Those with networks, contraband, or hardened survival skills quickly identified him as a target. Nick's inexperience in conflict, lack of allies, and a lingering dependence on external support left him exposed to exploitation. Tasks that others avoided were thrust upon him. Moving contraband, taking the blame for infractions, and performing dangerous errands for temporary protection. Each act deepened his entanglement in the prison's underground economy, stripping away both agency and dignity. Sleep deprivation compounded the psychological damage. Fluorescent lights never turned off, and the cacophony of metal doors, screams, and scuffles reverberated through the facility. Nick's panic episodes became more frequent, often triggered by minor disturbances. His responses ranged from frantic screaming to incoherent muttering, reflecting a mind overwhelmed by stimuli and stripped of any familiar structure. The constant tension prevented rest, leaving him perpetually fatigued and more vulnerable to manipulation and psychological collapse. Physical deterioration mirrored the mental decline. Skipped meals, poor nutrition, and the stress of survival caused his weight and strength to decline. Observers noted that a body once imposing began to lose tone and endurance, evidence of the unrelenting erosion caused by an environment designed for punishment and control. Nick, accustomed to a life where physical well-being was guaranteed, now faced the stark consequences of deprivation. Every day of exposure to harsh conditions accelerated the breakdown of both mind and body, a silent and inexorable sentence unfolding long before any legal judgment. The looming legal outcome intensified his psychological strain. Nick faced 2 counts of first-degree murder, and the prospect of a life sentence cast a persistent shadow. The court's recognition of his mental health struggles could lead to a forensic psychiatric commitment rather than conventional incarceration, but even this offered no relief. Such facilities subjected individuals to strict monitoring, heavy sedation, and controlled environments where personal freedom was minimal and time was measured in decades rather than days. For Nick, the legal process was not merely a question of guilt or innocence. It represented an extension of the confinement and exposure he was already enduring, a system that could indefinitely perpetuate the erosion of his identity. Interactions with other inmates continued to reinforce his vulnerability. In a prison where strength and strategic cunning determined status, Nick's lack of experience made him a perpetual target. Superficial gestures of camaraderie, often offered by white inmate groups or others sharing superficial commonalities, were conditional and ephemeral. They could withdraw at any moment, leaving Nick isolated and exposed. The pressure to conform, comply, and navigate the covert social codes of the facility became a relentless test, with minor missteps carrying disproportionate risk. Nick's mental health, already fragile, became a focal point of concern for his defense team. Attorneys highlighted the dangers of prolonged isolation, exposure to chronic stress, and the lack of effective mental health care. They argued that his deteriorating condition threatened not only his well-being, but also his ability to participate meaningfully in his defense. Competency questions became intertwined with the trial itself. Could he understand proceedings, communicate with counsel, and make informed decisions? Each lapse in cognition, each episode of dissociation, cast uncertainty over the legal process, further amplifying the psychological burden he carried. Even amidst the chaos, fragments of Nick's past life resurfaced in unexpected ways. Memories of Brentwood, of parental protection, of endless indulgence, intruded upon the stark reality of confinement. These recollections were not comforting but destabilizing, highlighting the chasm between the life he had known and the unyielding conditions of Twin Towers. The constant juxtaposition of past safety and present vulnerability created a cognitive dissonance, reinforcing his disorientation and eroding any remaining sense of control. As Nick's psychological and physical state continued to decline, the cumulative weight of environment, social hierarchy, and legal uncertainty pressed down relentlessly. His identity, once defined by privilege, protection, and parental devotion, was gradually stripped away. Survival became a matter of enduring exposure, navigating danger, and maintaining the fragile coherence of a mind under siege. The interplay between isolation, exploitation, and the looming life sentence formed a scenario in which every moment was a test of endurance, a stark illustration of the consequences of a life suddenly bereft of privilege and protection. Nick Reiner's trajectory at Twin Towers was no longer simply about awaiting trial. It had become a prolonged, inescapable confrontation with the limits of his own resilience. Each day underscored the fragility of a man unprepared for deprivation, untested by hardship, and exposed to an environment that rewarded cunning, strength, and ruthlessness. The intersection of mental collapse, social exploitation, and legal peril painted a grim picture, suggesting that for Nick, the prison system itself had become both the judge and the relentless executor of a punishment that extended far beyond the courtroom. As Nick Reiner's time in Twin Towers Correctional Facility stretches forward, the question of his survival, both mental and physical, remains uncertain. The life he once knew, filled with comfort, protection, and privilege, has been replaced by an environment that respects nothing but resilience, awareness, and the ability to endure constant pressure. Inmates judge, manipulate, and exploit weakness, and Nick, with his fragile mental state and lack of experience in adversity, is at the very bottom of this unforgiving hierarchy. Each day presents a new challenge, and even minor missteps can carry disproportionate consequences. The possibility of a life sentence looms large. Should Nick be convicted of 2 counts of first-degree murder, he would likely be transferred into the California state prison system, where maximum security and supermax facilities enforce strict routines, prolonged isolation, and constant surveillance. In these institutions, time is measured not in days or months, but in the slow erosion of self. For someone like Nick, unprepared for hardship and lacking protective alliances, survival would require adaptation to a social and psychological landscape far removed from anything he has ever encountered. The stakes are extreme. Isolation, violence, and exploitation are not hypothetical. They are embedded in the structure of daily life. Even the alternative path of forensic psychiatric commitment offers no respite. Such facilities, while ostensibly designed to treat mental illness, subject individuals to strict monitoring, heavy sedation, and regimented routines. Release is rare, often decades away, and the environment can be as restrictive and psychologically taxing as conventional incarceration. For Nick, both paths converge on a single reality. His identity, autonomy, and previous life are effectively gone, replaced by a struggle for survival dictated by the prison's unyielding rules. Family support, which had once been absolute, is no longer a factor. Nick's siblings, affected by grief and shock, have made no public statements indicating continued financial or emotional support. The severance of familial protection removes the final lifeline that might have mitigated the harshness of prison life. Nick is forced to confront an existence where wealth and reputation carry no weight, and where every advantage he once relied upon has been nullified. The psychological toll is immense. Daily exposure to threats, chronic sleep deprivation, inadequate nutrition, and constant sensory stress continue to erode his mind. Episodes of panic, dissociation, and identity confusion persist, underscoring the fragile boundary between sanity and breakdown. The environment amplifies pre-existing vulnerabilities, transforming them into ongoing crises. Every interaction, every task, every moment of enforced awareness reinforces the relentless pressure bearing down on him. Ultimately, Nick Reiner's situation poses broader questions about justice, mental illness, and a human capacity to endure. The intersection of a horrific crime, untreated psychological vulnerability, and a punitive environment highlights the tension between accountability and survival. While society demands punishment for acts of extreme violence, the reality of incarceration, particularly for the mentally fragile, is rarely humane. Nick's fate, suspended between life, mental collapse, and the unrelenting machinery of the prison system, forces a confrontation with uncomfortable truths about the cost of crime and the limits of protection, wealth, and privilege when removed from the sheltering context of family and society. Nick's journey from Brentwood luxury to the stark, unforgiving walls of Twin Towers serves as a cautionary tale. It illustrates how a life of indulgence and protection, once stripped of its safety nets, can quickly become a psychological and physical struggle for survival. Every day is a test, every encounter a risk, and every moment a measure of endurance. Whether he can withstand this environment, retain his sense of self, or emerge from the system intact remains unknown. What is certain is that Nick Reiner now faces the full weight of consequence, a reality in which comfort, influence, and status no longer exist, leaving only the relentless demands of survival, justice, and the fragility of the human mind.